When Ukraine President Zelensky woke up this morning, he realized that for all the fancy rhetoric, threat of sanctions, and villain profiling of Russian President Vladimir Putin, no one was actually coming to help him and his country in their hour of need. He said that in so many words. He should have taken a lesson from India and her experiences in the past. We, in India, have always known the bitter truth that in times of conflict or an attack on our sovereignty, no one can help you and no one even wants to help you. You have no choice but to face the enemy on your own. And knowing this truism has shaped our middle of the road yet firm response to the Ukraine crisis. And our line has, of course, not been particularly liked in the West and even by some elements in the Congress party back home. But we are sticking to our guns, and rightly so. The conflict in Ukraine is not a morality show or a test as some would like us to believe. It is not a land grab situation either. It is a realization, firstly, that a fancy club of rich white countries, in this case NATO, does not call the shots anymore in restructuring Europe as they think fit. Secondly, it is a realization that Russia, with a history of immense suffering and sacrifice and achievement, cannot be treated lightly and disrespectfully. And thirdly, the conflict is also a stark realization that some countries can only offer rhetoric and not much else. And finally, the lesson to take away home is that in times of war, you are all alone and left to your devices. So help you, God. Hi and welcome everyone to the CAA show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis, and my name is Juggi Bhasin. CAA is the Thinking Folks show, and therefore we invite all of you to become a subscriber of our show by pressing the red button on your screen. Subscription is of course completely free. Now let me expand on the 4 points I have listed earlier. Disregard for a moment the rhetoric that Putin is a second Hitler, an autocrat who wants to revive the former Soviet Union. Putin is nothing more or nothing less than an existentialist who wants to protect his country's boundaries and create a buffer zone to stop NATO's push eastward deeper and closer towards Russia itself. Ukraine, Russia, frankly, in terms of boundaries, are a bit like Delhi Gurgaon. They are that close and interlinked. How would we feel if a hostile force tries to take over Gurgaon and threaten Delhi? All big countries have their sphere of influence. Would America tolerate any Latin American country acquiring nuclear weapons? Will India tolerate if the same happens in its sphere of influence in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan? Fact is, Zelensky was not only the most pro-Western leader Ukraine has ever seen, but he was giving enough hints that Ukraine would go nuclear. And not to forget, his ardent desire to make Ukraine a NATO member that would have brought the North Atlantic Alliance at Russia's doorstep. And let us remind ourselves as to why NATO came into existence in the first place. It was created to counter the former Soviet Union. But if that entity, that is the Soviet Union, does not exist any longer, what is the need for the alliance to keep incorporating more and more former Eastern Bloc countries? And why Ukraine? Would that not be like waving a red flag in front of a bull? Given all that, let us now see that how NATO responded when Putin carried out his threat. Of course, there was a lot of media condemnation. There were imposition of watery sanctions that everyone knows will dissolve after some time and not much else. Certainly no boots on the ground. Not even depriving Russia from the worldwide SWIFT transaction system that could have hurt Russia. Just blocking of some banks and funds of Russian oligarchs in the West. And no one is asking the question, what was the ill-gotten wealth of these oligarchs doing in Western banks and institutions in the first place? Why had the banks not followed their KYC norms and vetting the source of funds norms? The reality of the matter is that this issue is not about Ukraine at all in one sense. It is about Biden getting a reprieve from his domestic problems and inflation issues at home. An enemy abroad is a good distraction. It is about Boris Johnson sweeping the Partygate scandal under the carpet with some diversionary, tough rhetoric. And it is also about French President Macron, who wants to shore up his popularity in the upcoming presidential elections. All the major entities in this bloodletting tragedy have their own agenda, and the only ones holding the can are the Ukrainians and their beleaguered president. India understands what the great game is all about. We have the experience. Did anyone come to our help when we faced Chinese aggression in Galwan Valley recently? Besides some tepid bit of Western support, not one country stood by our side. On the Kashmir issue, how many countries gave us full support? Most Western countries use Kashmir to deliver homilies and lecture to us on what we should be doing. Even in our earlier conflicts, did any one country come to our help? Even in 1971, despite the Treaty of Friendship with the then Soviet Union, we fought that war alone and won. That is the lesson of history, and that is why we are not going overboard and jumping in to condemn one side and lionize the other. Sometimes serving our own interests is the toughest call to make. And we have precisely done that. Let not criticism of a Shashi Tharoor or the Ukrainian ambassador to India divert us, deflect us from our stand. War is a dirty business, and there are no clear villains and heroes in any one conflict. There are only self-interests that have to be protected in a conflict. So, on this note, I come to the end of this episode of the CAA show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our show, do subscribe to us. And on this note, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.